As with Santiago's comments, which was that there are so many components of this thing, I'm just talking about some aspects for which I've been doing some analysis. The package itself includes new environmental standards or bottom lines for various measures of in-stream water quality. It's also got regulations on stock exclusion and fertilizer caps, and new requirements for resource consents and farm plans. So what I'm talking about is some work on the costs of end discharges and benefits of as many components as possible, although the wetland benefits were done separately. And the cost benefit work that I'm going to talk about is looking at the impacts of the new policy package against two baselines or counterfactuals. One is of no policy and one is of the implemented national policy statement for freshwater management. And that contrasts with some of the previous economic analysis that had been done, which had just done the analysis against the no policy counterfactual, rather than the fact that already there is some policy already implemented or put in place. There are limitations to the work I'm going to talk about. One is just the tight time frame for analysis. We had some discussions in December, but essentially the work was done over the first 3 months of this year. And then we kind of got into the start of lockdown, which kind of mucked things up a bit as well. Other limitations, there was no integrated model, so we've kind of had to piece together the various bits of analysis, including a separate biophysical model, and then building a model to analyze the costs and separately the benefits. We used NIWA's clues model for the biophysical aspects. It has no forward projection, so it's not, although we're doing our analysis through to 2050, we've got no projection of what land use might be in 2050 or how it's going to change from here to there. So essentially we're looking at effects through to 2050, but assuming that there's no change in land use from what it is currently. And that's just, we are constrained to do that by the modelling available. There's also a time lag in the water quality improvements because soils around the country differ in terms of how long it will take for any reduction in discharges to feed through into improvements in-stream water quality. And those differ hugely around the country, but NIWA has got no systematic database to go to work out where that might happen. They know that there are problems or longer periods in some parts of the country than others, but not in any way that can be easily modelled. And then we were constrained by just the availability of data. There was nothing that we could immediately just plug into the model. So essentially we're trying to do, in a very short space of time, build a model to address the costs and benefits with little available data and imperfect models that we could use to assess the effects. So I'm going to talk as much about methodological issues as I am about results, and bearing in mind all these constraints. So the components, we started with these regulatory objectives, the targeted outcomes, and from that we could do the biophysical modelling of what that might require in terms of N and P reductions. And I'm going to focus just on the N reductions. From that, we then analysed the mitigation options, costs and effectiveness in order to achieve those. The cost numbers were then fed into some work that NZIER did to do a CGE analysis of the wider economic impacts, but I'm not going to talk about that today. The benefits were then measured directly from the regulatory objectives, assuming that they would be met. And I've got a dotted line to the comparison of costs and benefits, largely because all I'm going to do here today is do a partial comparison because there was a bunch of work done elsewhere. In terms of NIWA's modelling, they did the modelling at the catchment level. So we had 11,186 separate catchments. We were looking at the change in outcomes at the terminal reach of the catchment. But when we came to do the analysis of how to achieve those reductions, we were assuming that reductions could occur anywhere in the catchment above that terminal reach. And there were different scenarios that we looked at in terms of the dissolved inorganic nitrogen as measured in that terminal reach. And it was measured with different assumptions about periphyton spatial exceedance criteria. And I'll just explain what I mean by that. Periphyton, and there's a delightful picture of some green slime, which is what we're talking about here. Nutrient discharges increase the amount of periphyton, so reductions will reduce it, but there are a whole bunch of other factors at play. So for a given amount of nutrients in the river, there's a risk that the predicted amount of, or the targeted amount of periphyton will be exceeded. And so if you're going to achieve a low risk of exceedance of 10%, you'll need a much greater reduction in N in order to get there. Whereas a 30% exceedance risk is allows you to discharge that much more N. And the main assumption for analysis was in the middle at 20%. Okay, so for the cost model, and I'll explain that first and then talk a bit about the benefits. So we had this reduction requirement in 11,000 catchments, and we were trying to work out the least cost discharge reduction in each catchment to meet those requirements. So we had further data on the land use in each of those catchments, how many hectares in each type of land use, and there was kind of 15, 20 different land use types. We then had land typologies, so slope, drainage, and so on. And we had N and P discharges by each land use type. We pulled together mitigation options and costs and effectiveness by each of the land typologies. So the land typology was a mixture of the land use, so dairy, and the land typology, say steep and poor drainage or something like that. And in addition, we had land use options. So in addition to on-farm mitigation, there was also the option of changing land use completely. And for that, we had different profitabilities of those land uses and discharge rates. So you could look at the before and after effect of that. That was combined to work out a kind of a least cost cost curve for reducing emissions in each catchment. From that, we could estimate the total costs and the total change in land use, and then we combine that with an assumed rate of implementation of the policy package. So to pull together the mitigation cost numbers, as in what can you do on a farm in order to reduce discharges, there were lots of papers and studies out there which looked at quite specific things and costs of specific things for a specific land use in a specific place, but we really needed something more generalized that could be applied because we were in a hurry, and we couldn't just put together hundreds of these different things and put it into a model because it was just going to be too complicated for the time we had available. So we worked with papers and analysts who had used bundles of options, and we particularly focused on some work by Richard McDowell and also a study by Landcare, Motu and NIWA, focused on greenhouse gas reduction, but applicable because it had effects on N discharges. And that classified a whole bunch of things that could be done on a farm into these kind of M1, M2 and M3, which increased in their effectiveness and increased in their costs. And here's an example of how MFE then took those various bits and combined them. And here's an example from dairy, where we had these different typologies. This is a dairy example. So the typologies were D1 to D8, and they were in a different location, either North Island or South Island, different slope characteristics and different drainage characteristics. They then had different levels of effectiveness and different costs. So we'd set up the model in order to produce cost curves, but in a sense, by using these simple bundles, the cost curves kind of grew themselves. So it was a simplistic analysis in terms of these costs, but that combined a whole bunch of things. Essentially, it's saying, look, there's some easy low cost things you can do, there's some medium cost things, and there's some high cost things that you can do. From that, we were able to analyze the costs. Skipping ahead. We also had data on the land use profits in each region, and these were taken from a bunch of different places, some that had directly analyzed those costs and where those weren't available, analyzed those profits. Where that wasn't available, we used land values and derived a profitability from that. We also had this assumed rate of implementation of the policy, which was then used in estimating the present values through to 2050. I'll skip through this. From that, we could then work out the costs over time, and the costs go up with this kind of rate of implementation that affected how the costs would come in. As you can see from that, a large percentage of the costs was for dairy and for land use change. This is for the when you're looking at significant amounts of emission reduction, and this is to get the tightest level of N reduction, a lot of the reduction came from land use change. When we were in a scenario in which less was needed, we had far more as a percentage from the on-farm mitigation options. There was also a large bunch that is just in an other category. And this was where we basically said we need to get to these limits or these reductions in nitrogen, but we actually can't identify how to do it in this catchment because we didn't have data for the land uses that had to reduce them or a bunch of other reasons. So where we couldn't achieve the target, we just assumed that the target would be met and used average costs from other land uses or other areas in that region. This is the results. The highest costs are for dairy in the Waikato and Canterbury. And as I said, the other is a significant proportion of total costs, which is basically where we just have not identified how we will actually meet these limits, but we assume that they will be met at average costs. We then did an analysis of what that might mean through to 2050, which is when the policy program would be fully implemented. It was done at various discount rates, but 3% was used as the main decision criteria. And I have highlighted the main or the base case assumption that was used with the 20% periphyton criterion and static in terms of technological change. We also looked at some sensitivity analysis as to how technological change may reduce costs over time. Okay, so that was the cost analysis. Sorry, this is a very brief romp through it. Questions, as I said at the bottom there, remain over the interaction of this policy with climate change policy, which is also going to require quite a lot of land use change if we end up meeting some of those targets through afforestation, which will replace some of the lands which are currently discharging N. Benefits. When we're analysing the monetary benefits of these changes, we're essentially asking what are people willing to give up to obtain improvements in water quality. We were limited, again, because of time, to existing studies and using benefit transfer. There are significant data gaps because most of the studies are very local. What's the impacts or the benefits of improving water quality in this specific river? And there was little that was applicable to the very things that I was examining on the cost side. So there was good analysis relevant to swimmability, ecological quality, and water clarity. Most of, or the entirety of our estimate of the quantitative benefits came from a study by Peter Tate and co, and I think Peter might be online here today, so he can answer some tricky questions on this. But this derived from what was most useful here was that this was a national study with a representative sample of the population, asking, essentially using a choice modelling approach, from which was derived a willingness to pay for improvements in human health risk and swimmability of rivers, the ecological quality, and water clarity. So we had some numbers that we could use for that, albeit that it didn't apply to all aspects of the benefits of the policy package, such as the periphyton. Those benefits were used to derive present values through to 2050, assuming the same rate as implementation as we had before. And we identified a whole bunch of other benefits that we couldn't quantify, including ecosystem services, protection of drinking water, some commercial impacts avoided, such as guided fishing being able to continue. There were additional greenhouse gas reductions, the avoidance of irreversible damage, which was the value of early action, as in if we left it till later, some of these reductions in water quality may be irreversible at that stage. And there was also the issue of, in New Zealand, reputational value, which I've got huge question marks over, but there's a possibility of a benefit from that too. And comparing the costs and benefits, and I've left in colour the bits that came from this, the study that I'm just talking about here. So the major benefits were derived from this analysis. Wetland ecosystems were, the benefits of that was basically done by saying what would we need to install in terms of flood defences and other things to replace the benefits of wetlands. And there was a bunch of other cost analysis that went on in parallel to this. And so the costs I'm talking about here is that kind of little red rectangle at the bottom. All of this is available in some studies on MFE's website. There is the link there. Thank you.